Welcome to the Fat Tony's podcast, where we bridge the gap between everyday life and expert insight. Join us in conversation with real-world experts, gaining practical advice and strategies to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of the Fat Tony's podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking to who I know as Porkchop Express, who is known on Twitter for her love of killer boots, killer fashion, sardonic wit, but above all, her passion for Dostoevsky. Porkchop is going to be schooling us on Dostoevsky's work, how they can change your lives, from the existential crises depicted in Notes on the Underground, to the moral conflicts of crime and punishment, all the way through to the spiritual redemption found in the brothers Karamazov. Porkchop Express, welcome to Fat Tony's. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Seth. Thank you for having me. This is such a special occasion for me because I don't usually do podcasts or conversations, recorded ones. I've only done one a long time ago, I think almost 2 years ago. So this is quite special. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. It's fascinating. You're one of these many intriguing people that I've got to know through Twitter primarily, which seems to be my main form of social engagement these days, which is a little bit sad. But I'm going to start off. I want to ask you, you spend a lot of time talking about Dostoevsky on Twitter, partly in the form of humor, partly serious. But what originally drew you to Dostoevsky's work? And why do you devote so much of your energy to it?
That's a good question. I have been very bored, I think as much as everyone else, probably more than everyone else during the COVID lockdowns. And I have been looking to read some fiction. And I remember going once through Nassim Taleb reading recommendations list, and he had demons there. And I thought, well, it's probably a good recommendation. So I was going to start with demons, but then I noticed that on Twitter, people are talking about the brothers Karamazov, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll start with that. And once I started, I was just so surprised by how much what I call random wisdom there was in that book. And I do think it makes sense now if you know how he wrote the novel. And I think he tried to squeeze all of his philosophy and all of his wisdom in this last novel. So this is why, to be honest, looking at it technically, it does seem like a potpourri, just so much together, everything. It can be even seen as incoherent, I would say, if you compare it to his other novels. And even though it is seen as his best, it is personally not my favorite. But I think he has been very revelatory in the way how much it's like a tsunami of wisdom and philosophy just like coming at you. You don't expect that, I was kind of expecting like a story, an intense story, because I didn't have any expectations. I don't like to read about the author of the book. I read it myself, so I didn't have any expectations. But I was kind of intuitively expecting a story, maybe psychological character building, something like that. But it was just this agglomeration of just wisdom. It was quite unexpected. I was really blown away. And I remember asking people on Twitter, like, hey, this is the first thing I read. Like, do I keep my expectations as high going into his other novels, or should I lower them? What am I to expect going forward? This is a pretty high bar. But I have to say, I started reading his other novels, and my favorite it turned out to be Demons, because I just love the storyline. I love the political philosophy behind it. I find it extremely relevant today still, and it remains my favorite novel. So did I answer that question, or did I?
No, absolutely does. I think you touched on a little bit about explaining current contemporary politics and what's happening today. I definitely want to come back to that a little bit later because I think it's super relevant. I will start with a confession. I don't know too much about Dostoevsky's work, but it's interesting. You described it almost like a romance there. You were sort of like, you go through, you have these really high expectations, you're beginning to fall in love with it, and then you have this worry of like, is it all going to be this good?
Yeah,
Really interesting listening to how you got into it. I've heard people say that you can't understand Dostoevsky's work without taking it in context of his life. Now, did you know much about his biography before you started reading him?
No, actually, I avoided on purpose reading about his biography. I really wanted to have a blank slate of just kind of figure it out myself. And I think it hasn't been after 2 or 3 novels that I actually looked into his life and biography. And I know it sounds strange, but that was, like I said, a purposeful thing. And it did make sense. It was like, oh, okay, now I understand where this is coming from. I mean, he thought he was going to die, and he was pardoned the last minute. So, and then he went and spent years in a Siberian prison camp. So, okay, yeah, I can imagine someone who went through such a transformatory experience will come on the other side with something to tell. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, for the benefit of our listeners, so I'm not going to give a detailed biography of Dostoevsky. I don't think I could, quite frankly.
Yeah, let's keep it. Let's keep the intrigue.
But at a very high level, there was a period in life where he was arrested and persecuted for, I believe it was reading banned books, being part of a literary circle in Tsarist Russia.
He was in a kind of like a progressive leftist kind of legal circle.
And yeah, essentially, there was a point at which he was scheduled or sentenced to be executed by firing squad. And
yeah, and he was standing there.
Yeah, and he had this last-minute reprieve and ended up going to Siberia for a number of years instead. And I think there is some of this autobiographical stuff. I think there's an element of that in The Idiot, where I think one of the characters is going to be executed by firing squad and has a reprieve. Now, the reason this is a long-winded way of drawing up to another question I had, and I don't know the answer to this, but I've heard it said that kind of up until that period in his life, Dostoevsky was quite critical of organized religion, had kind of an atheist mindset, and that incident of believing that was the last few moments of his life changed or affected him and some of his attitudes. Now, and that is reflected in his later writing, apparently. I mean, from what you see, from your opinion, I mean, is that bullshit? Is there an element of that? Do you see a shift in some of his works from organized religion is bad to organized religion is either good or more personal?
This is an interesting statement. I think this is an interesting statement that he was not religious before. I don't know. I haven't read on that specifically. I find it a bit strange to believe because he grew up in a very kind of traditional Russian family, and he speaks about reading the Bible growing up with a lot of passion. I have the sun reflecting off. Sorry about that. It looks really weird. So he was speaking about with a lot of passion about reading the Bible when he was a kid. And with so much love and remembering everything and how he talks about how it influenced him and what beautiful memories he had, specifically about reading the Bible growing up. So I find it extremely strange and to believe that that's true, that he was not religious before. What could be true is that he might have changed his opinion on death penalty, because he was actually quite anti-death penalty in his later works. And he speaks about this being an inhumane punishment. And he also speaks in The Idiot that the minute before you think you're going to die that's the punishment, but he also perceives it as extremely humane. That's why he was outspokenly anti-capital punishment in his works later. Maybe that was the change. I tend to not agree that he was not religious before. So that's the first part of my question. And the second part was, is there a difference in his works? Because actually he didn't write that many works before he was sent to prison. He wrote a few short stories. Apparently they were quite popular, nevertheless. But if you read them, they are very light. You can see the psychologist, the talented psychologist, and how can I say that? Someone who's knowledgeable with human nature, who understands human nature. But it's very light. It's not trying to dig deep into the depth of the soul and, trying to analyze the characters from the brink of insanity as in his later works. So his early works, they're very, like Dostoevsky light. Interesting to read, good psychology, but nothing dramatic in terms of spiritual exploration or definitely nothing particularly philosophical. That was my impression. I actually read recently his pre-prison works, and as much as they're pleasant to read, they don't blow you away. There's some interesting thoughts here and there, but you think, oh, this guy really understands, human psychology, but it's not something that you would say, you will not guess that this is a prophet of the entire human race as he is currently known, as he later developed himself.
It's really interesting. I've heard it said there's so much in these novels. I think you picked up on it, but there's like a microcosm of human nature. There's the beginnings of existentialism. There's the beginnings of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. There's meditations on what it means to be human. All of this kind of wrapped up. Why do you think his works are so distinguished? Or why do you think this distinguishes him from other works at the time? Why do you think there's so much in there? Was he a result of the life and times he lived in? Or do you think there's something more innate about him as a person?
I think he underwent such a strong introspective process in prison. Like if you read what it has been for him, and he had five or 10, I don't remember exactly how many years of introspection and a learning about human nature. So that's one part of the puzzle. And I think the second one is something innate in him that he felt the society's kind of like undercurrents. He kind of had an intuitive feeling of where society was heading. So I recently read, I'm now reading an analysis of Russian theologist named Berdyaev. He wrote a pretty large work, entirely on Dostoevsky, and he compares him shortly to Tolstoy. And he says Tolstoy is a brilliant observer of modernity, of the people that he sees. Dostoevsky was both an observer of modernity, but he was also very much focused on the future. He turned out to be prophetic about a lot of events that happened not only in Russia later, like 50 years later, but in Europe as well. You could say it is almost like somebody taps into some kind of, if we were to use some esoteric terms, you could say the way I feel he is, that he had some kind of ability to tap into the collective consciousness and feel the currents and kind of visualize and explain where they headed. And his time frame was not 5 or 10 years. It was 50, 100 years. That is shocking if you read. But he says, civilization does not make people. He says, okay, we have this. There was, of course, a lot of progress in his time, technology, in terms of political progress, progressivism was actually called that. Left was called progressivism. And he was really going against the current by saying, look, this civilization is not making us better. In fact, by satisfying all our needs and by taking care of a lot of our problems and struggles and material struggles, we might end up so bored, well, not directly bored, but of course he's using abstract terms, that we will start doing terrible things that we have never seen before. And that did happen in the 20th century, and that happened exactly under the conditions that he described, that it happened in a civilized country and not in an underdeveloped country. So he saw that coming more than 100 years away. That is shocking, that is mind-blowing. Can you imagine at the time, he was probably seen as like a doomsayer, party pooper, imagine that. So this is why I say he had this kind of, maybe some kind of esoteric not talent, but gift, that he could feel where humanity's headed, in spite of everything that's happening.
That's really interesting. Kind of, where have we been? Where are we going? I know I was reading an anecdote about, I think quite late in his life, when he was in his 40s, he had the opportunity to travel around Western Europe quite a bit. And one of his stops was in London to view the Crystal Palace, the great exhibition. And he was absolutely disgusted with it and absolutely disgusted with the direction that he saw civilization heading in. And in many ways, I think it was his near contemporary, John Ruskin, of a British art critic, who was also had a slightly different take on it, but had a kind of similar disgust with Victorian society. And he said, the Victorians are the busiest people that have ever existed. And there's a bitter quote by him, which was, the goddess of the age may as well be the goddess of getting on. And he thought we were losing, in this industrialization and rapid change, we were kind of losing our humanity a little bit. I want to take a step back slightly and talk about pragmatic, practical advice, because I'm conscious a lot of people here won't be familiar with Dostoevsky. I've got to say, I think he gets a bit of a bad reputation. He has an undeserved reputation of maybe being a little bit misanthropic and certainly being a little bit difficult to read for a newcomer. I've got a friend who tried to read, Notes from the Underground, and he was saying that he had to reread the first few chapters about 10 times because he just could not understand what was happening. He could not make sense of it. Did he pick a bad book to start with?
Look, I struggle myself with Notes from the Underground. I read it once. I was almost angry at it, and then I read it the second time, and then it made so much more sense, especially the philosophical part. So I'm not sure why that changed in my perception. What was that caused by? But definitely, I would definitely not recommend Notes from the Underground as a starter. I am usually quite direct in terms of what people say, where should I start? I say, look, always start best. If you cover that, then, you've covered it, you can move on to the next best thing. But why would you not start with the best? And the best is universally accepted as Brothers Karamazov. So do that. If you like it, you can move on to something else. And I do not think that it's in any way inaccessible or difficult to read. I think it's like I said, a little bit like hodgepodge, too much at the same time, maybe not very coherent, but just don't focus on the storyline. Like, that's another thing that is very important to understand about the Brothers Karamazov. Do not focus on the storyline, and it barely makes sense. It has some kind of coherence to it, but everything else is like, the storyline is the skeleton. You can do it without it, obviously, but the value of the book is in all these random pieces of wisdom and inspiration and philosophy, and like how you feel when you read those things. If you ask me, like, you can just strip the storyline. It's like, I find it so, what can I say? Well, I think I've said it already. It's not that important, not that interesting to me. So, and that's why so many people cannot summarize or explain what it's actually about, because I personally think it's relevant. So just don't focus on it. Focus on this little bits and pieces that blend, that shine through. I think anyone who reads it deeply and thoughtfully will feel inspired to live in a different way and will feel a little bit like spiritually reborn.
It really is interesting, the slightly undeserved reputation that he may have for being, or his work, should I say, being pessimistic or nihilistic. There is a huge amount of humanity in there. The whole human experience, I think you were saying, captured.
If I could say something about that, he wanted to explore the absolute depths of human nature. You cannot explore the depths of human nature without going into the darkest parts. And in there, he, unlike anyone else, finds a lot of, redemptive qualities. So it's like, I once compared reading Dostoevsky to walking through a dark tunnel, and there's going to be light at the end. I mean, you might feel like, oh, what's going on? But at the end, there is going to be light. And to me personally, Brothers Karamazov was one big, it was not a dark novel. I did not, in spite of all the weird storyline, I did not think it was dark. But I do know, I do acknowledge that some other his novels can be seen as dark, and Demons is definitely very dark. And in Demons, there is very little redemptive in terms of human nature. I think Demons was mostly meant as a warning to us. It was not, it's in that sense, it's an exception from his other novels. Even in Crime and Punishment, there is a very strong redemptive aspect at the end. But I would say Demons does not have it. And even though it is my favorite novel, I do see it as a bit of an exception compared to his other novels. So he does show humans, individuals at their worst. But at the same time, if you are objective, he has so much faith in humanity that is actually surprising. In spite of everything you know about him, it is still surprising. If you read his notes from prison, it's quite shocking. I mean, how much love someone can have for his fellow humans, and at the same time retain his objectivity. He's not naive. He's definitely not naive. So he's more prone to be seen as too dark and to maybe too negative, but definitely not naive. So even if you know that, and you still see how much love he has for his fellow humans, it's incredible. So I do not agree that he's depressing, or it's a very shallow, very superficial interpretation. It probably comes from people not forming their own opinion, but more like basing it off this meme. It's basically a meme at this point. I think it's the most appropriate way to describe it. It's a meme. It's not true. If you read him thoughtfully and you read several works, you will see that it's not true.
I totally agree with you. There are some amazing anecdotes out there about just how much humanity he had, not in his personal life. And I was reading an anecdote about when he was sentenced to. So he originally was sentenced to 4 years in the Siberian prison camp, I believe, and then after that, I think it was 6 or 7 years of forced military conscription.
Yeah, somewhere between 5 and 10.
Yeah, I think it was a total of 10 years. So I think it was 4 years in prison. And in between, after he was released from prison, he had to embark on this 12-day sleigh ride through Siberia to get to where he was going to be in military exile. And I was reading an anecdote that halfway through, about 6 days into this sleigh ride, he had consoled the other prisoners so much that there was one guy, and I'm going to read this name here, Ivan. My pronunciation of Russian names is terrible, and I apologize. There's one guy, Ivan Yetshembinsky, who was so surprised and touched by Dostoevsky's kindness that he abandoned his decision to kill himself before they got to the military camp. So I think this conception of him being a nihilist, or not having that human side to him is a complete myth, or if not a myth, maybe a very shallow interpretation of his work.
It's the opposite of that. It's the opposite. It's the complete opposite. I want to explain. For him, he achieves his expression of love and trust that the human soul can redeem itself. And I think he achieves that through unconventional methods, so to say. So he does that by going as deep and dark as possible. And people kind of only perceive that, and maybe they never finish the book, or just don't think too much about it. So they say, oh, this is so dark, I'm not going to shoot it. No, I think that happens a lot. So.
Well, I'm definitely going to be reading more of him. I wanted to touch on, you mentioned how prosaic he was in seeing where society is heading, and how surprised you were when reading him. You're like, wow, he was so intuitive about where we're going, what's happening. I was surprised reading about him that he got such a harsh punishment for what was essentially being involved in, reading a few banned books, being involved in some politics he maybe shouldn't have been, certain groups. And in the context of the time, there was this revolutionary fervor sweeping through the great powers of Europe. So you can sort of see now the paranoia that the Tsarist Russia might have had to avoid these ideas spreading any further. What I find really interesting is, despite essentially being an intellectual, when he was sentenced to the prison camp, in the documentation, he is listed as one of the most dangerous convicts at that camp. And that's really interesting because, he wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't a particularly powerful person. But what perhaps made him so dangerous were his ideas and where we're heading. So I find it interesting that maybe they even realized that at the time. What do you think about that?
I think that was his ideas developed much later. So I doubt that that was seen. That was the reason why he, if that's true, that he was seen as particularly dangerous. I think it might have been so because of his left-leaning ideas. Because if you read, if you know, his first novel was For People, for Folk. So I think he was very much. He stayed until the end. Kind of poet of the underdog. So he was always supporting the weak underdog. So he stayed like that till the end. But I think in the beginning, in particular, it was blended with the strong political, fervor. So what eventually developed into a more religious fervor was more of a political thing at the beginning. So maybe because of that, he was seen as a dangerous convict. I think me and you, Seb, would make a good team on Dostoevsky because, ironically, I have not read much about him. And you seem to have read a lot about him. So I've spent the last, I think, three years just reading him and his diary. It was a very, heavy read. It took me a long time. So I don't know much about him, about his life, as explained by others, by third parties. So I imagine there's actually a lot that I don't know that I should know about that. I'm being honest about that because I just focused so much time on just reading and rereading his works. Now is actually something new to me that I'm reading about him. So I started reading this analysis by Verdaya. That's new to me. So I should probably know more about his life as from a historic point of view, but to be honest, I don't. I know what he says himself about himself and about his life. That's what I know. But I know it's not the full story. For example, I know he had trouble with gambling, and he apparently owed people money and didn't pay them. So he was himself not like a perfect, not like a saint. So I mean, it's also not a secret because he did write The Gambler based on his own experience. And when he actually owed money, he wanted to make money for the publisher. So it's not a secret, but I do realize that if I were to read what others wrote or said about him, it will be like a fuller picture.
That's interesting. I'm gonna circle that again. There's so many themes here we could unpick, but I want to try and stay vaguely high level. And this next question, I'm gonna leave it deliberately open ended, so you can comfortably answer as much or as little as you want in terms of current events. But you mentioned Dostoevsky's themes and ideas remaining relevant today in contemporary society. Could you talk a little bit more about how and why and how you see through that lens?
Yeah, I think I once spoke about it on Twitter. I said, if you want to understand politics and society and where it's headed, you are probably better off reading, for example, Dostoevsky from 200 years ago and see if there is any kind of overlap or any common themes. And if you find those common themes, you probably know they're here to stay. So it was really, actually, it's almost funny, when you read Demons, when how he describes the intrigues or the social dynamics in progressive circles and how people would turn on each other and cancel each other. It's just so funny, And I was a bit frustrated even because people talk about these things like the cancel culture or people denying the importance of family as if it's something so new and so revolutionary, like it never happened before. We're unprecedented times, but you're reading Dostoevsky, and there he is talking about, progressives at the time, saying how, nothing is your fault. It's all the fault of the society around you, and we're going to build a new society, and you're not going to suffer because everything will be taken care of, and family is not important. We can have this kind of communes, and nothing new, absolutely nothing new. And also the dynamics, the political dynamics between this in this social environments, there is. So I was frustrated because, okay, I'm reading Dostoevsky for the first time. How about the rest of you guys? Where have you been this whole time? Why are you talking about this as like a new thing? You should have known that this also happened 200 years ago, apparently. So that's maybe not panic.
Yeah.
These things apparently tend to come and go, and the probably the tendency of the progressive movement, is to exaggerate things, to maybe they, this ideas they come and go, and there's probably more suitable times for them to kind of reemerge, but apparently nothing.
There's it's endlessly fascinating, and maybe I'm a little bit guilty of being fooled by randomness in reading too much into what little I've read and what little I've seen of him. But there's a brilliant little excerpt in, I think it's Notes from the Underground again, actually, and he talks about the cruelty of human society and how we tend to moan about humiliation, but then spread that humiliation to others, or love broadcasting that humiliation to others. And the first thing I thought of was, that sounds a lot like reality television. And, we sort of take that cruel delight in broadcasting to others. Do you think there's any kind of, how can I, so from what I know of the main characters, there's a lot of the human condition in there, but they all tend to meet quite tragic ends. And is there, or if not tragic ends, I haven't seen a lot of redemption, or the theme of redemption, in Dostoevsky. Am I missing it anywhere? Is there some in there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the most obvious example is Crime and Punishment, redeemed by love. The end in prison.
There's a little bit of Crime and Punishment in that, I don't know. I see wrestling with moral ambiguity, and I see wrestling with the human condition, but I can't think of a character from what little I know that kind of truly finds redemption. And I wondered have I missed that? Is there, does that exist, or is that maybe his outlook that maybe we can't find redemption?
In terms of the character who very clearly needs redemption, that would be the main character in Crime and Punishment. That he's redeemed by love and reunited with his love in prison. That's the most obvious example. When it comes to other characters, other novels, I have to agree with you. It's not so straightforward. It's just, I don't think he made it a theme in his novels to express it explicitly, and I don't think he was writing with the purpose of giving his character a chance at redemption. But I remember why I always thought about that this theme is strong with him is because it's kind of woven throughout. It's not something that you can just say, oh, this character, all of them or the majority of them get redeemed. It doesn't happen. In fact, a lot of endings are not clear, and if anything, there is a more strong theme of his characters punishing themselves for everything what they did wrong, which is driving themselves completely mad and killing themselves, killing each other, suicide. That's more prominent. I think the actual theme of redemption is so it's like you can explain. It's I think throughout the novel you will see that how a character develops. Some of them are given like a second chance, or he puts words of wisdom, and he shows that even the lowliest characters are capable of something noble, or like a good act. I think it happens quite. I think there's a good example. I think in Crime and Punishment as well, where one of the characters who was just like this annoying guy who was just bothering everyone and just like seems like a useless type of person, eventually does. I don't remember details, but he does something very kind. And I think these types of examples are actually quite numerous in his work. He does seem to put, and that is something very particular with Dostoevsky. He puts words of wisdom even in the mouths of the lowliest, fallen, craziest character. And if you know he's doing that, you know he's not doing that randomly. You know he's doing it on purpose to show that even people that we perceive as like fallen, that they have no chance, they are just nuisance, they are drunks, they are alcoholics, criminals, and then suddenly they say something very wise, or he puts them in a position where they show a lot of they show themselves in a light that you would not expect. I think he does that quite often. And I think you might not notice that if you're not focused on that, but I noticed it right away with him, and I started paying attention, and he does it very often. So maybe that's what I think. I think he tried to show that, look, do not dismiss the weak, do not dismiss the underdogs, do not dismiss the criminals. They still have a lot of humanity left in them. Do not forget that. And I think he learned that in prison. And I think he talks about that as well in his prison memoirs, that even that one of the most fascinating aspects of spending so many years with such hardened criminals was to see those glimpses of humanity in them once in a while. And that he talks about it with a lot of passion. So I think to him, it was a very important aspect of the human nature that he then later, I think, consciously added to his novels, but it might not be visible to the reader, I think, as directly as, unless you're a very, very kind of careful reader.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I think it's quite ironic that humanity displayed, if you look at Russian history, kind of the 50, 60 years after his death, we almost saw the inverse of that in the way society was structured. And that famous quote, one life is a tragedy, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And you saw a lot of death and a lot of, it wasn't so much the death, but humanity being reduced to a statistic, or the lack of humanity, the loss of humanity shown. So maybe.
Yeah, he did speak that the means are, he did warn us, try to warn us that for the revolutionaries, the means are, the ends always justify the means. And the premise of his novel, Demons, was to show that the revolutionaries will commit terrible acts in order to get to get the power. It's crazy because I can make reference to today. It has been acknowledged and pretty much accepted as a fact that the so-called Chechen bombings of apartment buildings in Russia in, I think, early 2000s, that was seen as a terrorist act that was actually organized by the Russian Secret Service in order to bring Putin to power. This is exactly what happens in Demons, where those revolutionaries staged terrible tragedies in order to have an excuse to restructure society and make it a better place. But to do that, they need to make it first as horrible as possible. And they will try to do the by any means possible. So he was warning us about something that was going to happen and happened several times throughout history, the 20th century history in Russia. So the question, and I remember actually reading that somebody was kind of blaming Dostoevsky for all those things that happened. They were saying, yeah, he wrote those books and they were in a way like not as much prophetic as they were, how do you say that? I forgot the term. There's a specific term for that. When you predict something and it happens because you predict it. I have it on the tip of my tongue. Self-fulfilling prophecy. So he was accused of that actually, because he saw that that's the what revolutionaries are capable of. The question is, he did not guess, but he saw the capacity for that in certain types of people.
It's really fascinating. I need to go away and read so much. I almost feel like I need to go and read a lot more of this, come back and kind of do a follow-up with you so I can go a little bit deeper into this.
It's going to take you many years. It took me 3 years.
And I'm so outclassed here. Normally I can sort of bullshit my way through a bit. This, I feel hopelessly out of my depth a little bit.
I feel out of my depth. I feel out of my depth too. I can only, like I said, I can only talk about what I interpreted myself, because I never read anything about him or interpretation of his works, and I feel like maybe I'm talking out.
Maybe we can do a Fat Tony's Dostoevsky book club.
We need an expert. We need a real expert, someone who's that, mythic, imaginary Dostoevsky. They exist. They do exist, but that's probably, I suppose, people actually dedicated their academic careers probably to studying him more.
No, I'm down. I am. These interviews always go so quickly. I'm always shocked at how quickly they go. We've got about 12 minutes left, and what I want to do, I always have the chance for the Fat Tony's community to post questions for guests coming up to an interview. They're always a bit unpredictable and you never quite know what you're going to get. So I'm going to read a few of them and they're going to be a little bit rapid fire. But the first one we have is, in your opinion, what is the greatest character Dostoevsky ever created and why?
The greatest character he ever created.
Or maybe your favorite character, if you don't want to say greatest.
Yeah, but these are two different answers. That would be two different answers. Like, probably the one that I like, and I cannot explain why. That's the strangest thing. I cannot explain why. I really like the character of Stavrogan in Demons. It's such a mysterious character. So much about projecting such power and still so much mystery about why, what happened in his past, what was driving him. But such a strong, powerful presence in the character. And that's my favorite. The greatest ever created. I don't know. I think it would have to be someone in the brothers Karamazov, and I would say I don't want to. I cannot answer that because I can imagine some people would say it's actually the idiot, the Prince Mishkin.
Maybe it's impossible to have a character in isolation because, a lot of his books are ensemble. There's so many people. And to rip one out of the context of a novel doesn't make them great. It's almost reductionist.
And also what makes someone great? Is it a powerful character? Is it a character that teaches you a lot? Is it a character that represents the best of humanity? I would say if you wanted, for example, just go with the definition of a character that represents the ideal human. For Dostoevsky, that would be Prince Mishkin, the idiot. For sure, that would be his, kind of like a saint that is not even accepted by society, seen as a madman, simply because he's a kind, nice person. So, in that respect, I think that character meant a lot for him. And I think for the rest, all of his characters are so powerful, but also, as previously mentioned, extremely deranged, a lot of them so deranged. Even Mishkin was deranged, but in a good way. So it's hard to say that any one of them is great in a sense that we can all agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great answer, to be honest. Okay, moving on. Next rapid fire question. Do you read them in the original Russian language, or what language do you read them in general? And does it make a difference in any way to the English translations?
I read them in Russian, and I always have a reference of an English translation at hand, because when I post quotes, I'd rather use an existing translation than translate myself. No, it doesn't make a difference, and I will tell you why. People tend to think, it's true for many authors, the original language hides a lot of nuances that are not easily translatable. And for example, Tolstoy, that's more relevant than Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is not a poet. He's not a master of the language. He's not concerned with that. His language is very straightforward. But he does have long sentences, kind of woven thoughts, but the thoughts are very straightforward. So he does not play with language. He does not use nuances of the language that you think would make such a big difference. He's focused on the message that he wants to communicate. It's very straightforward. Nothing gets lost in translation. It's really nothing to worry.
That's really good to hear. I know certain books that Nassim Taleb has recommended, or he hates saying he recommends books, but certain ones he's talked about. He's mentioned that, he read it in the original French and it really does lose something. It's still worth reading in English.
French people, they love to play with language. All French offers to them, French is like a jewel that they tend to, put in the light and see the reflections of what can we make with this beautiful language that is French. And I can see that, yes, if you're a good writer, French language is of primary importance. I mean, if you communicate with French people, even today, write an email. Nobody can write an email like a French person. There's going to be 10 sentences, which can be summarized in one sentence in English. So French, yes, definitely. Some Russian offers, some are probably untranslatable. But Dostoevsky, paradoxically, that's not a concern. Good news, everyone. No need to learn Russian.
There you go, folks. You heard it here first. You do not need to worry. Okay. What else have we got here? Let's see what other people have submitted. Are there any lesser-known works by Dostoevsky that you believe deserve more recognition than they get? And if so, why?
I think his diary is such a treasure chest of everything. His philosophy, his views on society. In fact, everything that you see in his novels probably originally first came from his diary. So sometimes you see the same thought repeated verbatim in his novel that came from his diary. So you know that everything he thought and most of his philosophy is to be found in his diary. So I find it strange that it's such a lesser known work. Nobody ever mentions this, nobody talks about it. I kind of stumbled. I was actually lucky to get it. Even in Russian, it was almost impossible to get a physical book. And I'm not even sure it's available in full in English. Like I tried to find it in English, I couldn't get the full version. Maybe if you're lucky, you could find it in like in a secondhand shop. It's very, very strange that it's so kind of under the radar, even though it contains the entirety of his thoughts and philosophy.
Okay, and this is kind of linked, but is there any particular aspect of his writing, either a passage or a book or an idea, that you think is misunderstood or overlooked?
Yeah, I would say he is being brought up sometimes, especially in the light of recent events and Russia's, Russia's wars, and people always say, first, people try to dismiss the culture of Russia, which we need to be very honest that what happened before the Russian Revolution and what happened after. These are two very different Russias, right? And that's the first aspect we need to consider. And second is, people see traces of imperialistic thinking in his work. Okay, well, that's a controversial topic, but which European, Russia was an empire at the time, and he defends some of those ideas. Okay, well, which large European country was not an empire at the time? And it was probably seen as unpatriotic to not defend your country, your empire at the time. So I don't think in that respect he was in any way different from his contemporaries in Europe, except the rest of Europe moved on from imperialism and this way of thinking 100 years ago, and Russia didn't. That's the only difference. But sorry, it's not Dostoevsky's fault. So we just take a step here. And, that was, to me, that's frustrating. I am not a supporter of Russian wars of invasion. I see the culture for what it is. I am very critical. I understand that this is a completely different country since they had the revolution more than 100 years ago. The culture and all the achievements they're quite outstanding. If you list them, most of them will be before the revolution, and everything kind of went down. So saying that, sorry, I lost my thought. It's just not entirely fair to blame him or any of the old Russian writers for whatever's happening in Russia today. In fact, they would be probably horrified if they knew. Dostoevsky did make one mistake, though, in the way that he saw so much that was coming. He was wrong massively about one thing. He thought all those terrible revolutions and all this is going to happen in Europe. He thought it was going to happen in France or somewhere, that this huge revolution where everything is like completely being just torn down in a new society. He thought that was going to happen in Germany or France. He did not think that it's going to happen in Russia because he had, in a way, this very naive idea, and that's where I'm critical of Dostoevsky. He had this naive idea that Russian people are somehow naturally very religious and resistant to those ideas. So he did see the danger coming from certain parts of society, but he had this really strong conviction that he was really wrong about, that the majority of people in Russia are not going to let this happen, that kind of revolution. And he was a strong believer in that. And he so often talks about, he's critical of the society, he's critical of what's happening with the peasants and the generation, the alcoholism, and he's so critical. And yet, he had this very naive idea that he literally says, our people are able to kind of pull themselves by their own hair, pull themselves up by their own hair. And that's where he was wrong, because all the things that he feared actually did happen in Russia. So I think if he would have been totally horrified and shocked if he saw what's happening there today. So for people to kind of try to demonize him and his legacy, to make a political statement, which I support, is just wrong.
Fascinating. Wow. I feel like that question alone, or that answer alone, we could have a whole hour-long conversation on. I think it would maybe be prudent if Dostoevsky was required reading maybe for all politics and sociology students. There's so much to unpick there. I'm gonna request a few bits of information just to post after this as well. Maybe Porkchop's suggested Dostoevsky reading order, and we can try and indoctrinate and bring a few more people into this world.
I think a lot of people would definitely benefit from reading Demons. They would get a perspective that they are really missing.
Well, I totally agree. And we are, sadly, I think we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. These always go by so quickly. It's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you briefly about this. In the last 2 or 3 minutes, I always ask my guests, do you have anything you want to give a shout out to? Any resources you want to mention? Anything you want to talk about that I've not asked you? It's kind of your free last few minutes.
No, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. But the truth is, I always feel like I don't have much to say. This is like a persistent feeling with me. For somebody who tweets so much, I actually continuously feel like I have nothing to say. And whatever I do share from reading him is what comes to me, organically while reading him. And I just want people to get at least those bits and pieces without, if they don't have the time or the luxury like I do to read those novels front to back, that at least they get those bits and pieces of my small public service. But I don't really have like a message that I'm trying to bring on a consistent basis. This is the reason why I also don't have a Substack, or I don't do any podcasts. And I know that some people disagree with that I have nothing to say, but I feel like that. So I like to answer questions. I love answering questions. I really enjoyed answering questions. I think they were very interesting. And for someone who supposedly doesn't know much, as you introduced yourself, I strongly disagree. I think as I said, we would have made a really good team, You seem to know a lot about his life. And I just love sharing. What I learned, I feel like, wow, I just learned this. I want others to know this. And that's what I tweet. That's what I want to share. But
so maybe the message is simple. Maybe it's just 3-point plan. Number 1, read Dostoevsky. Number 2, follow Porkchop on Twitter. Number 3, shitpost about Dostoevsky.
And number 3, follow Fat Tony. He knows a lot about his life.
Yeah. Yes. Don't forget to follow us as well. Listen, Porkchop, we're coming up to the end now. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining. I know there are a lot of people who follow you on Twitter are going to love really just hearing you in conversation. It's so different seeing someone online and just following a Twitter handle compared to, hearing them, seeing them, interacting with them. So I've certainly enjoyed.
Hopefully not a huge disappointment.
I'm sure they won't be. All right. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for having me.